Chapter 9 The Fates against Tecumseh. One who refused to sign the Greenville Treaty was Tecumseh, the young Shawnee chief who had fought so bravely at Fallen Timbers. After the battle he went west and then south, living with various tribes other than his own, to learn their languages and make friends with them. Certainly Tecumseh was one of the most appealing Indian figures of history. He was handsome, with penetrating eyes, and a fine figure, and agile as a wildcat. Not only was he a heroic warrior, but he was one of the greatest orators his race ever produced. His voice was thus described: it possessed the vibrating resonance of an organ, and when roused to one of his fiery outbursts, seemed to pulsate through the air with a magnetic power that was irresistible. His manner was lofty and impressive, and there is no question that he won the admiration of even the white men who knew him. He has been called the most extraordinary Indian in history. Looking at him today, we must conclude that the brilliance of his personality obscured the fact that he seemed born under an evil star, traveling among other tribes with no whim on his part, for early in his life he formed a plan that was colossal in scope. Pontiac was his ideal and model, but in his vision he outstripped even the great Ottawa. Tecumseh's dream was nothing less than a permanent federation, a nation of Indians that would embrace every tribe east of the Mississippi. To form such a federation was a gigantic and complicated task, since it meant uniting 100 tribes, which were of different customs and districts, and were often feuding. But with his wonderfully intense enthusiasm, to which he added an equally magnificent ability in diplomacy and statesmanship, he threw himself into the work, and almost succeeded. To begin with, he foresaw, long before most white men, that there would soon be another war between Britain and the United States. Statesman that he was, he counted on this war to help him establish his Indian Federation and his people's rights, for he was one of the first to think of all Indians as one people, regardless of tribal or other differences. Tecumseh's twin brother, Tenskwatawa, was a medicine man, by some means perhaps through Tecumseh, who had contacts with a few prominent white men. He learned there would be an eclipse of the sun on a certain day. Making a great ceremony of predicting it, he gathered a huge crowd of Indians, and when the sun died and then came back to life, the onlookers were seized with intense excitement. The medicine man had now become a prophet, and as the Shawnee prophet, he became the head of a religious movement, being regarded by countless savages as a sacred being, and preaching return to the old, primitive life and ways of their ancestors for the purification of their lives and restoration of their race. All this exactly suited Tecumseh, whose master mind saw how religious enthusiasm could be used to weld the tribes together. With satisfaction, he watched people from many tribes gather together and form a great Indian village, known as Prophet's Town, on the Tippecanoe River, a few miles north of the present city of Lafayette, Indiana. By 1810, his work had so far progressed that he hurled a bold ultimatum right into the teeth of the white man. At a council with General William Henry Harrison, he denied the right of the government to purchase lands from any single tribe, since it belonged to all Indians, and said that if white aggression continued, he would oppose it with war. It was an immense step forward in Indian policy, and by this and other acts Tecumseh now had become the most noted Indian in America. But he had no intention of fighting yet. He was waiting for the inevitable conflict with Britain, for his great gathering of the United Tribes to aid the British and win for themselves security in their country. So, giving strict orders to his brother that there should be no hostilities in his absence, he went south in 1811 to organize the tribes there. His wonderful eloquence won to him most of his hearers in the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Cherokee villages, and the overpowering impression his personality made, even on those who hesitated, was shown by a strange happening. Leaving a Creek village that had been cool to him, Tecumseh said indignantly, "When I reach Detroit, I will stamp my foot, and the very earth shall shake." By a remarkable coincidence, the tremendous earthquake of New Madrid, Missouri, took place December 16, 1811, about the time the Creeks computed that he had reached his destination. It was so violent that it caused a great area of ground to sink, creating Reelfoot Lake, and it shook the country for hundreds of miles. With their houses falling about them, the Creeks rushed out in frantic terror, crying, "Tecumseh has reached Detroit." It seemed that the great Shawnee had achieved his purpose. He was jubilant at the thought that his federation was complete and ready to play its decisive part when the British-American War came. Yet at this moment of victory, even before the earthquake convinced the wavering Creeks, his dream was shattered. While Tecumseh was gone, his brother, the prophet, greedy for personal glory, had disobeyed his orders and busied himself stirring up war spirit among the Indians. So dangerous was the situation that General Harrison marched to the trouble spot with 1,000 troops, arriving near Prophet's Town on November 6th. 3 chiefs, remembering Tecumseh's orders, came to him asking for a conference and promising there would be no hostilities. So Harrison and his men camped about a mile from the village. The prophet, however, was less loyal to his brother's commands than the 3 chiefs. Ambitious and vain, he spent the night working the warriors in his village into a frenzy. Before dawn, November 7th, 1811, about 1,000 fanatical braves, without leaders and largely without plan, hurled themselves suddenly on Harrison's camp. In their first mad assault, they drove in the pickets and charged toward the center of the camp. But Harrison was alert, and his well-trained soldiers had slept fully clad, with their arms beside them. As the shooting, howling foe came on, they fought back with desperate determination. In the darkness, guns lit up the swirling conflict, and fired point-blank with muzzles, almost against the bodies of their targets. Bayonet and rifle butt clashed and thudded against tomahawk and war club. Yells, cries, the reports of guns, and thudding of feet filled the night with a terrifying din. But the Indians could not break the soldiers. When daylight came and Harrison could see, he sent his men in a series of discipline charges that drove the Indians with bloody losses from the field and scattered them. Then, though he had lost about a third of his army in killed or wounded, he destroyed Prophet's town before returning to Vincennes. Tecumseh arrived a few days later to hear news that to him must have been terrible. The Battle of Tippecanoe had upset his entire plan. His warriors had been wasted in a useless and disastrous night battle without proper leadership. Worse, all through the Indian country, the word was running that it was no use to fight the white man, and that the great alliance had failed. Poor Tecumseh imagined his anguish and disappointment at seeing his whole great dream wrecked. One can sympathize with his fury and despair when later he confronted the prophet and seized his brother by the hair and almost shook the life out of him. But it was too late to change things. What made it even more heartbreaking to Tecumseh was the fact that the War of 1812, the British-American conflict he had clearly foreseen, and on which he had counted, began the very next June. From that day, Tecumseh's life was an unhappy anticlimax. He joined the British with hundreds of warriors who remained faithful to him. They gave him the rank of brigadier general, but he seldom wore the gaudy uniform, preferring the costume of his people. In the War of 1812, he fought bravely in a number of engagements. It was not, however, as the supreme leader of a united Indian people, as he had dreamed. Instead, he was subordinate to a man he despised, the British commander, Colonel Henry Proctor. Even in war, he was chivalrous and merciful. When Proctor permitted the terrible massacre of American prisoners at the River Raisin, January 22, 1813, Tecumseh was not present. After Harrison repulsed Proctor at Fort Meigs, Tecumseh was present and rode up furiously to halt another slaughter of some prisoners as Proctor looked on. "Why did you not stop it before?" he demanded of the British colonel. "Your Indians cannot be restrained," said Proctor. "Go," thundered Tecumseh. "You are not fit to command. Go put on petticoats." With Tecumseh gallantly holding off Harrison's grim advance, Proctor retreated with almost indecent haste into Canada. But at last Tecumseh had had enough of retreating. He compelled Proctor to make a stand on the Thames River, Ontario. The battlefield chosen was good for defense. The Indians on the right in a swampy woods, the British on the left with their flank on the river. But Harrison had 2,500 men to his enemy's 1,500. Tecumseh, sensing defeat, seems to have decided to die on that field rather than live on in the bitterness of his failure. Gathering his chiefs about him, he said, "Brother warriors, we are now about to enter a battle from which I shall never come out alive." As the fighting started, an American cavalry charge broke the British line. Procter fled, and his men surrendered. Tecumseh, however, rallied his bravest warriors for a battle to the death. Again and again the great Shawnee, though wounded severely, furiously fought off his enemies. At last he was almost alone, like an epic hero, bleeding, gasping, but undaunted. From one side, a soldier aimed his gun and fired. The ball passed through Tecumseh's head and killed him instantly. He died as he had wished, fighting in the heat of battle. About him lay the bodies of 23 of his faithful warriors, and many of his foes. Tecumseh left a name unforgettable in history, but he should be remembered as one against whom the fates seemed to conspire to ruin all his great plans and hopes. His tragedy was not in his brave death, but in his failures. He did not succeed in any of his major goals, and even before his end, his mighty dream of a universal Indian nation was hopelessly destroyed. Yet he left seeds of resistance to the white man that very soon would grow into a new Indian war, this time in the South. Red Eagle and Andrew Jackson, Chapter 10. Some Indian wars were justified. New England settlers fought in self-defense against Canadian Indians, whom they had not harmed because those Indians were set upon them by the French. The Creek War of 1813-14 is in a similar class, but this time it was the British who incited the Indians. The Creeks were far advanced toward civilization. They lived in permanent towns in what are now Georgia and Alabama, farmed, raised cattle, horses, sheep, and hogs, and because of their numbers, about 30,000, and their prosperity, were somewhat proud and haughty. Their men were taller than average European men, and some of their women were considered beautiful, even by white standards. Indians and whites frequently intermarried. While France still held Louisiana, a certain Captain Marquand, commanding Fort Toulouse, near present Montgomery, Alabama, married, under Indian custom, a Creek girl of the Wind clan, from which chiefs generally were drawn, the descent being by the female side. A daughter named Sehoy was born to this couple. Marquand was killed in a mutiny, but Sehoy, his little demi-French daughter, grew up to be famous for her beauty. In succession, she was consort to a minor chief, to Colonel Tait, of the British Army, and finally to LaShawn McGillivray, a Scottish trader. By Tait, she had a daughter, who later married Charles Weatherford, another Scotsman. Of their children, the most notable was William Weatherford, known to the Creeks as Lamachat, Red Eagle. By this lineage, Weatherford was half Scottish, a quarter English, an eighth French, and only 1/8 Indian. Yet he was a Creek of Creeks, a thorough member of the tribe, hating the white man and preferring his Indian name. His descent through his mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother, all of the Wind clan, entitled him to rank as a chief. Tecumseh's visit to the Creeks in 1811 made a tremendous impression on Red Eagle, and even after the failure of the Indian Confederation, he was a leading spirit in urging war against the Americans. In this he was aided by British agents in Spanish-held Pensacola. who were glad to supply the Creeks with arms and ammunition for that purpose, but the tribe was divided. At least half wanted peace, while some wild young Creeks one day murdered several settlers. The Peace Party Creeks, led by Big Warrior, hunted down and killed every slayer. That widened the division in the tribe. The villages who wanted war erected poles, painted red in their public squares. Thus they became known as Red Sticks, to distinguish them from the peaceful Creeks. It was Red Eagle who led the Red Sticks in a series of raids against both white and peaceful Creeks to avenge the killing of their young men. A party of immigrants was slaughtered, and some of the settlers took arms to stop the trafficking guns between the British and the Creeks. When a posse of these settlers met a band of Creeks returning from Pensacola with their newly obtained weapons, there was a skirmish on Burnt Creek. The settlers were beaten. The Creek War had begun. About 35 miles north of Mobile, Alabama, beside Lake Tennessee, was a stockade known as Fort Mims. There, at the first alarm, most of the surrounding white population gathered. All told, there were 573 persons in the fort, many of them women and children. Of these, 150 were militia, commanded by Major Daniel Beasley. The commander was top lofty, arrogant, and contemptuous of the Indians. He failed to take proper precautions, even flogging a Negro slave for spreading false rumors, when the poor fellow reported seeing many Indians in the vicinity. For that stupidity, Beasley and all in Fort Mims paid the heaviest of penalties. At noon, August 30th, 1813, the gates stood open while the drums beat mess call. Suddenly, more than 1,000 warriors, led by Red Eagle, burst from the nearby woods and sprinted silently for the fort. They were within 30 yards of the gate before Beasley himself saw them and gave the alarm. He tried to shut the massive gate. Too late. Now at last, howling their war cries, the Creeks poured through and cut him down. With that, the stockade became the scene of a horrible, indescribable butchery. Men and women were cornered and killed like pigs. The few who shut themselves in the fort cabins died terribly when their refuges were set afire. In that bloody hour, 437 persons, almost all of the women and children, were murdered. Only 36 escaped. One, a Negro girl, badly wounded and half dead with terror, floated downstream, hidden in the bottom of a dugout canoe, and brought first word of one of the worst massacres in history. That news reaching Nashville, Tennessee, brought from his bed, where he lay suffering from wounds received in a duel, a brilliant and implacable fighter, General Andrew Jackson. He wasted no time. With such troops as he could gather, he marched at once for the Creek country, in spite of his physical conditions. That winter, Jackson had endless trouble with his militia, many of whom left him because their enlistments had elapsed, and he fought some fierce but indecisive battles, but with a willpower few men have matched. He kept together some sort of an army, built a military road into the Indian country, and when he received some reliable reinforcements in the spring, struck Red Eagle's forces like a trip hammer. The Red Sticks had built a stronghold at Tohopeka Horseshoe Bend. This was a peninsula formed by a wide loop of the Tallapoosa River. Across the narrow neck, they constructed a very strong and high breastwork of logs. Back of this were their village and supply houses. The place is now covered by Martin Lake, Alabama. Toward this fortification, Jackson marched rapidly with about 2,000 men, including a regiment of regulars, cavalry led by General John Coffee, some Tennessee riflemen, Indian scouts, and a few small cannon. He arrived at the fortification March 27, 1814. Behind their ramparts, the 800 Creek warriors greeted him with yells of defiance. Their medicine men had told them the white man could not possibly capture their stronghold. But Jackson, grimly surveying it, said, "I've got them now." He began by sending Coffee's cavalry and the Indian scouts to take positions all around the river loop, cutting off escape. Then he formed his infantry before the breastwork and told his artillery to open fire. The cannonballs did little damage to the log defenses. Of far greater importance was an exploit by a few Cherokee scouts, who silently swarm the river and set adrift all the canoes which the Creeks had gathered for a possible retreat. The dismay with which the Red Sticks learned their escape was cut off soon changed into a more desperate mood for resistance. Shortly after noon, Jackson ordered a charge. He led it himself, riding a white horse, the regulars on his left, and the Tennessee riflemen on his right. A withering fire crackled from the Indian ramparts, and men began to drop here and there. With the figure of their gaunt, grim leader ahead on his white horse, the men never once hesitated. First, on the breastworks was Major Lemuel P. Montgomery. He was shot dead. Second, on the breastworks, and first over them, fighting among the furious Creeks, was a young officer named Sam Houston. Then the whole line came tumbling over the rampart, driving the Indians back. Still the Creeks fought desperately among the ravines, brush, and log huts of the peninsula. Houston, wounded in the thigh by an arrow, was ordered out of action by Jackson. Presently, the fiery youth, only 20 years old, was seen leading a charge against an Indian blockhouse. Down he went with more wounds, from which he almost died. But so heroic was the act that it won Jackson's admiration, and from that day he and Houston were fast friends. One of America's great history-making teams. The blockhouse was set on fire, and the last of the Creeks driven from their hiding places. Some tried to cross the river, but were shot down by Coffee's men. Others fought to the death. Only a few escaped. After the battle, 557 dead warriors were counted, and this did not include bodies carried away by the river. Jackson lost 49 killed and 157 wounded. Red Eagle was not among the dead. Either he escaped, or he was absent that day. When the Creeks begged for peace, Jackson said sternly, "Bring Red Eagle here, bound hand and foot, and we will talk of peace." A few days later, a tall, light-colored Indian, naked to the waist, presented himself before Jackson and said, I am Bill Weatherford." The general glared. "How dare you show yourself at my tent after murdering women and children at Fort Mims?" "I am come," said Red Eagle, "to give myself up. Do with me as you wish." "I ordered you brought in chains," said Jackson, "but you come of your own accord. I would gladly save your nation, but you do not even ask to be saved. If you think you can contend against me, go lead your warriors." The Indian drew himself up. "Well, may such language be addressed to me now? There was a time when I could have answered you. I could animate my warriors in battle, but I cannot animate the dead. General Jackson, I ask nothing for myself, but I beg you to send for the women and children, who have been driven out into the woods without an ear of corn. They never did any harm. Kill me if the white people want it done." Jackson poured his guest a glass of brandy, and promised to help the women and children. Red Eagle promised to persuade his braves to peace. The two men shook hands, and the Indian vanished from the view of the astonished soldiery, a not entirely graceless figure. Chapter 11. The Sorrows of the Seminoles. If the Creek War was justified, that against the Seminoles was disgracefully unjust. Strangely enough, the Creeks and Seminoles were almost the same people. About 1750, part of the Creeks left the tribe and went south into Florida, then owned by Spain. The remaining Creeks called those who left Seminoles, or wanderers. They kept the same language and customs. After Jackson defeated the Creek Red Sticks, some of them fled to these southern relatives and preached hatred of the whites. For their part, the whites, particularly the slaveholders, did not like the Seminoles because they befriended Negroes escaping over the line into Florida. There was trouble on the border during the War of 1812, and in 1818, Jackson, by then a national hero through his victory at New Orleans, invaded Florida. He destroyed several Seminole towns, captured Pensacola, and executed 2 British subjects, Alexander Arbuthnot and Lieutenant Robert Christie, Armbrister, for arming the Indians and stirring them to war. The general was severely criticized for his high-handed actions, but he so clearly showed Spain's inability to enforce laws in Florida, much less defend it, that the United States, in 1819, was able to buy the territory for the trifling sum of $5 million. No sooner had Florida become an American possession than injustices against the Seminoles began. Land sharks coveted the best of Seminole lands. Negroes were seized as slaves. One who was carried off into bondage was Ch9-11, a Creek woman of mixed Negro and Indian ancestry. She was the wife of a Seminole named Osceola, and mother of his 5 children. Her husband afterward gave the whites good reason to remember their wicked act. Under heavy pressure to force them out of Florida, some Seminoles at last signed treaties, first ceding most of their lands and later giving up the rest, and agreeing to move as a tribe to a reservation beyond the Mississippi. The second treaty, at Payne's Landing, Florida, in 1832, was bitterly opposed, and only 7 Indians signed it. One who fought it was Osceola, a tall, erect, proud man, then 29 years old, with an expressive face and light eyes that showed his mixed parentage, for his grandfather was a Scot. Ascella was not a chief, but in the troubles that followed, his fiery leadership made him the true head of the Seminoles. Asked to sign the treaty at Payne's Landing, he walked forward, drove his hunting knife through the document and into the table beneath, and exclaimed, "That is the only way I will sign a treaty with the white man." Then he walked out, to be arrested almost at once by the order of General Wiley Thompson, the Indian agent. After 2 days in irons, he did sign the treaty, but with no intention of living up to it, and when he was freed, he left a terrible threat: "I will make the white man red with blood, and then blacken him in the sun and rain, where the wolf shall smell of his bones, and the buzzard shall live on his flesh." His first warlike act was to shoot down a chief of his own tribe, Omthala, who sided with the whites and was returning home with money they paid him, forbidding his followers to touch the dead man's gold. Osceola scattered it far and wide in the forest. That was in October 1835. The Seminoles at once took to the swamps and went to war. Osceola's second act was one of revenge. He had a personal feud with General Thompson for arresting him. On the evening of December 28th, Thompson had dinner with some friends at the house of Erastus Rogers, near Fort King, Ocala, Florida. The weather was warm, and the windows and doors stood wide open. As the guest laughed and chatted, a shot rang out, and the general fell dead beside the table. Framed in a window, a smoking gun in his hands, was the fierce face of Osceola. A moment later, many Seminoles leaped into the house. 5 of the guests managed to escape to the fort, but Thompson, Lieutenant Constantine Smith, Rogers, and 2 men named Suggs and Hitzler were killed and scalped. On that same day, but some distance away, the first real battle of the Seminole War was fought. People had been killed in outlying settlers' cabins, and a convoy of provisions and munitions was surprised and captured, with 10 of the escort slain. To punish the Indians, 2 companies of soldiers, 110 men, under Major Francis A. Dade, marched from Fort Brooke, Tampa. A Spanish Negro guided them. It was learned later that he sent word of their route so that the Seminoles, with whom he sympathized, could waylay them. The troops crossed the Withlacoochee River on the morning of December 28th and traversed an open barren with some scattered pines at one side and a pond surrounded by thick sedge grass on the other. Nobody thought of an ambush, for it seemed impossible for any number of Indians to hide there. Yet in the sledge lay an old chief, Micanopy, and 200 Seminoles. All at once, the tall marsh grass beside the road literally flamed with a deadly volley. So close were the Indians to the unsuspecting soldiers that they could fire almost point-blank into them. Fully half the command was shot down at that first blast. Dade was killed first. Micanopy gave the signal for his braves to fire by shooting the commander dead. In surprise and confusion, the remaining officers managed to get their men over among the trees, carrying such of the wounded as could be moved. There they beat off the first attack. The Seminoles withdrew. Only 40 soldiers remained, unwounded, but these Captain Gardner set to work felling trees and making a breastwork, which he laid out in a rough triangle. They had raised this small defense only 3 logs high when the Seminoles were back, reinforced and shooting. So heavy was the Indian fire that it was death for any defender to raise his head above the incomplete parapet. Right and left, men dropped. Gardner fell dying with the cry, "I can give you no more orders, lads. Do your best." There was nothing that they could do but die. Before many minutes, the fire from the little breastwork ceased. Over it bounded the Seminoles. Only 3 men, all desperately wounded, escaped by pretending death. 2 died after reaching Fort Brooke. The third, Ransom Clark, lived for some time, but eventually died also. It was he who told the story of the battle. Now a desperate war was launched. A war completely baffling to the army. With their wives and children safely hidden, the Seminoles ranged at will. In the next 2 years, they attacked settlements and military forces from Jacksonville in the north to Fort Jupiter in the south. Osceola ambushed General Duncan L. Clinch and 700 men as they were fording the Withlacoochee. In an hour's fight, the whites lost 63 men, but the Indian leader, conspicuous in red sash and a headdress with 3 long feathers, was wounded. He drew off his braves. Pursuit was impossible, for the Indians also knew the secret paths through the morasses of the swamp country. Maddeningly, the Seminoles continued to strike, kill, and laugh at pursuit. The army imported bloodhounds from Cuba to trail them, but the watery trails baffled the dogs. A company of Indian trackers, chiefly Creeks, ran into a hard shooting war, partly in a swamp, and suffered so many casualties that it lost enthusiasm for the work and became almost useless. The war dragged on. Military reputations were made and lost, mostly lost. Finally, some of the Seminoles tired, among them old Chief Micanopy. They listened to offers of money rewards if they would surrender. In June 1837, 3,000 of them had been gathered at Fort Brooke by General T.S. Jessup, ready to make the long journey to the western reservation. On the black night of June 4th, 2 dark figures stole into the camp of the surrendered Indians, moving like shadows into the tent of the sleeping Micanopy. They held bared knives over him and told him they would cut his throat if he did not order his Indians to leave at once. Next morning, when Jessup rose, happy at what he thought was the end of the war, he was dismayed to find the camp deserted and every Indian miles away beyond pursuit. The 2 daring warriors who caused this evacuation were Osceola and his chief lieutenant, Cocochee, the wildcat. Jessup was furious, and one can sympathize with him, but nobody can sympathize with his act of treachery that followed. He arranged a parley under a flag of truce with Osceola, Cocochee, and some of their people. Believing themselves protected by the laws of the nations, the chiefs came. Suddenly they were surrounded by soldiers with leveled guns. Outraged, astounded, they could only surrender. That act, which was denounced by right-thinking Americans everywhere at the time, forever remained a blot on the name of Jessup and on the government, which never disavowed it. Cocoche made a daring escape from Fort Marion, St. Augustine, but Escella was sent for safekeeping to Fort Moultrie at Charleston, South Carolina. Brooding over his betrayal, he grew ill from loss of freedom, and at last refused to eat. He was found dead in his cell in January 1838. But his Seminoles fought on. On Christmas Day, 1837, Colonel Zachary Taylor, later to be president, located a band of perhaps 300 warriors on the north side of Lake Okeechobee. He had 1,000 men, but the Indians had the advantage of position, for a morass choked with sawgrass lay between them. At Taylor's command, a regiment began struggling across the 3/4 of a mile of bog, men falling under the Indian fire, and frequently drowning in the water holes when wounded. At last they stopped, and showed signs of retreating. At once Taylor threw in his 2nd Regiment. Now the charge continued. By a flanking movement, the Seminoles were driven from their small dry island. They lost 14 killed. Taylor had 26 dead and 115 wounded. The victory, if it was won, had been costly. After the battle, Taylor had about as much trouble getting out with his wounded as he had in reaching the place. 4 more years, the Seminoles led the exhausted, frequently famished, and fever-stricken troops from swamp to swamp, jungle to jungle, and bayou to lagoon, in a fruitless chase over a region of more than 45,000 square miles. White men traveled at peril of life in interior Florida, and hundreds were slain. At last, in May 1841, Cocoche was captured. Told he would be hanged unless he induced his people to emigrate, he replied fiercely, "You say I must end the war. Look at these irons. Can I go to my people, Cocoche, in chains? Never ask me to see them so. Could I go to them unchained? They would follow me, but they will not obey me when I talk to them in irons." He was finally persuaded to send messengers. His people were loyal. All of his band came in. Other bands followed. By 1842, Army officers believed they had shipped all the Seminoles out of Florida. They were mistaken. Seminoles remained, and not until 1844 did the last of them lay down their arms. The descendants of these still dwell, a colorful people, in the Everglades of Florida. For 7 years, no more than 2,000 Seminole warriors had defied, often defeated and eluded 10 to 20 times their number of troops. The war cost the government $20 million, 4 times the purchase price of Florida, besides the lives of 1,500 regular troops and 2,000 volunteers and settlers. And the treachery to Escella provided a black page in American history. It was the curtain for Indian fighting east of the Mississippi. It did not, however, end the resistance of the red man. West of the Mississippi, other tribes whose names were strange in the East, the Sioux, Cheyennes, Comanches, Modocs, Pueblos, Apaches, Nez Perces, and others, would continue to fight in future years, but the Seminole War marked the last real challenge to the encroaching whites east of the Great River, which was known to the Indians as the Father of Waters. And what was accomplished? We think of America as belonging to the Indians before the white man came. This is true only in the sense that a very thin population of natives hunted over it and occupied it. From the wide view, the view of the human race as a whole, it is not right for a vast area of productive land to be kept as an unused wilderness. Too badly does the world need food and materials. Where they are, men will go and make that land productive at any cost. It has been so since history began. So perhaps the chief, and almost the only, justification of the white man's driving of the Indian from his hunting grounds is this: where once the area of the United States harbored no more than a few 100,000 Indians, warring against each other, hunting, and sometimes starving, it now supports, in unequaled prosperity, more than 173 million people of all races, including more persons of Indian blood than were alive when Columbus first saw the New World.